Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience and thank you for joining us. I know it's a Friday afternoon and the weather is absolutely amazing. So thank you for joining us. Couple things before we get started. I want to make sure everybody is aware that this talk is part of our SolarSTEAM Journey to the Sun series. So next month, Dr. Stephen Still will be talking about a project that was done at SIU related to a bee colony during the total solar eclipse. So that should be really interesting. That's the last Friday of March. And then we've added a special event for April 8th because it will be 1 year since the total solar eclipse. So on April 8th, there will be a special look back on the whole festival we had here on campus. April 8th is a Tuesday, so it'll be 3 o'clock, but on a Tuesday instead of a Friday. There's also an art piece that has been permanently installed on the SIU campus that was from the Eclipse. And so there will, after the talk at 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, there'll be a dedication of that art piece. So we hope you'll join us on April 8th in a year since our very cool, very own total solar eclipse. All right, so with that, I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Brent Pease is an assistant professor in the forestry program at SIU. He is part of a really cool project that listened to the sounds of the eclipse. And what's amazing about this project is that it's a citizen science project. So there were so many people involved. So he's going to share with us what they did. And I've actually been kind of keeping my eye on this project. So I'm super excited to get more details. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for joining us. It's always great to see forestry students in the audience on a Friday afternoon. I wish you guys consistently showed up to my classes at 8:30 in the morning. But I will take you on Friday afternoon as well. Of course, some other familiar faces. So thanks for coming out. And thank you for the introduction. It's a long title, Eclipse SoundScapes, Partnering with the Public to Illuminate the Effect of Eclipses on Wildlife. And I have been working on this project with two colleagues out of the ERISA lab, Mary Kay Severino and Dr. Henry Trey Winter. And also, my colleague at Oklahoma State, Neil Gilbert, has been working on this with me. So this is a multi-agency or multi-organization collaboration, and as Dr. Brevik mentioned, there's lots of people involved. So certainly excited about this project. And I do need to mention, before we get into a lot more fun stuff, that ERISA Lab is the lead organization on this project. The Eclipse SoundScapes project is led by ERISA, and they were supported by, or they currently are supported by the NASA award number, I'm going to read this, 80NSSC21M0008. And everything here is the opinion of me, the presenter, and not of the funding organization. Okay, so about 100 years ago, we're looking at a publication titled Observations on the Behavior of Animals During the Total Solar Eclipse of August 31, 1932. It was published in 1935, so 90 years ago today, and it described anecdotal observations of how wildlife responded during a total solar eclipse. It's one of the few comprehensive reports that we have on multi-taxa responses, and it was just a group of researchers. They called themselves the Eclipse Behavioral Committee, and they were based out of the Boston Society of Natural History, and they sent out a call via newspapers for folks to participate and send in reports of what they observed wildlife doing during this total eclipse a long, long time ago. Not that long, relatively speaking, 90 years ago. Feels like a long time ago. Here's the path, a really zoomed in version of the path of where this study was focused on. So the dotted line, of course, is being the path of totality, and then these shading colors indicate less coverage as you extend beyond the path of totality. So places like Boston, it was like 99.8% coverage. But if you go all the way down here to like Raleigh, North Carolina, it was like 80% coverage. It lasted about 2 hours. Totality was 1.5 minutes. And it was in, as you can see, a very populated area of the country. So lots of people were here and could experience the eclipse. And one of the figures in that publication was this. And it was the localities from which they received reports during this study. And as you can see here at the bottom of the figure, they have the lines of the zones of totality listed there. And we have 98% on the map and 96% on the map. And if you look here on the orange lines of totality, you can see that they had a lot of observations within the path of totality. And they had some paths outside, or they had some observations outside of the path of totality. So they got a range of reports and observations in this study. I think they received about 435 reports in this effort. And here I want to share with you a few quotes of the paper, and this is how much of the paper reads. It's very quotes or anecdotal observations from people who submitted reports via mail to the Eclipse Behavioral Committee. One report says, a report by Mr. Araujo says, in several places birds flew against houses. Another says, hundreds of small birds which I had not previously seen flew like mad things, seeking trees and bushes as places of concealment. And some were a little bit more straightforward and short in their response, and they say, a nightingale was heard. And one of my favorite quotes from the paper comes towards the end of the paper when they're reporting on the mammal observations in the study. And they say the survey of mammal behavior has shown no demonstration of extreme nervous or mental disturbance such as that recorded of Homo sapiens. So it was it's a really fun paper to read. If you have a Friday afternoon, which it looks like you do, I'd go find this paper because there's lots of really fun anecdotal reports about what happened 100 years ago during a total eclipse. So what I'll say kind of in a summary is that for centuries, there have been reports of wildlife responses to eclipse. In this paper, this 1932 study, they talk about a study from 1544 about people reporting on how wildlife respond. So folks have, for a long time, been interested in how wildlife respond during this event. And in general, what we could expect is that we learned about some collection of vouchers of what folks observed during this time. And whether you're studying eclipses or solar flares or animal movement, we all need reference points in science, right? They're baselines, how we learn how things change over time. So at the very least, it was a documented baseline for what we could expect for wildlife to respond. I think another really important thing about this paper, though of course they did not call it this at this time, was that it started to show the power of the people. It showed the power of participatory sciences as a driver here, how we could learn about what is going on over a relatively large geographic space. This was kind of common in the early 20th century. There would be calls out in newspapers asking people to send in reports of whatever it might be. And just for a quick note, a quick 20-second note, less than 20 seconds, when I say participatory sciences in this talk, I'm talking about it as an umbrella term to speak to citizen science projects and community science projects. It's just a terminology change, but as a heads up, if you're unfamiliar with participatory science, it is the general involvement of the public in the research process. Okay? And finally, of course, the paper reported that wild and non-wildlife appear to be affected by eclipses. So it was important work, but it was primarily anecdotal work, right? These are just observations that people mailed in via whatever they might, and, however they got the notes in, and a lot has changed in 100 years. We've had a lot of technological advances, and today I want to tell you about one of those ways in which we have learned more about the eclipse, the nuances of wildlife responses, all through a project called Eclipse SoundScapes. So, before I tell you more about Eclipse SoundScapes, I want to tell you about my journey to the sun. Some of you might be familiar with some of these things I might be talking about. So my journey, I would say my journey to the sun in this project started with the Sounds of Nature Citizen Science Project. Sounds of Nature was a project that I started when I got to SIU, where we were aiming to try to discover biodiversity through sound. So it was a citizen science project in that people of the general public helped me collect data, and we analyzed it here and learned some interesting things. It was a straightforward volunteer process. Volunteers would sign up. They would say, hey, I can host a sound recorder at my property. I would put it in the mail. They would receive it. They would receive a bunch of instructions on how to run that sound recorder. We gave them videos. We told them all sorts of ways to do what we wanted them to do. They would run it at their house. They put it back in the mail. They'd come to SIU, and I would listen to birds all day long from these sound recordings. It was a lot of fun, and I really, and during those 5 days, they had a 4-hour dawn recording in the morning, and then a 4-hour night recording, and we did that for every single day that it was out. So we got 5 days of data about biodiversity in their backyards. And from this, We ran, as I mentioned, ran this project for a few years. We ended up covering several states in the process, covered lots of counties, had hundreds of deployments, and we learned some really cool things. One of the things that we did in return, and thanks to the volunteers for participating, was we created a data dashboard. And on this data dashboard, individuals could log into this website, zoom in to whatever deployment they wanted to zoom into. We provided them with a list of birds that we had heard during their deployment. So it was almost like providing them with a list of yard birds for them that they may have not heard before. And of course, these are all predictions, which I'll talk about soon. They came with a confidence score that you can kind of see over here. But it was just one way for us giving back and thanking the volunteers for participating in the project. We had lots of fun. We learned a lot. And we even wrote a few research papers out of it. Had a lot of fun. And I would say, though, in general, our group here at SIU was pretty well poised to deal with sound recorders, wildlife responses, biodiversity data. And I think we were ready to tackle an even larger question over an even larger geographic space. We had ideas about what we could study. We had plans and all sorts of projects that we wanted to kind of follow up sounds of nature with. But one day, during the summer of 2023, my wife came home very energized from a conference. And that conference was the 2023 CSI conference. And the CSI conference is the annual conference for the Association for Advancing Participatory Sciences. It's an organization my wife works with. And she comes home from this conference and she says, Brent, there is this really, really cool project that I just heard about this conference. And it's doing very, very similar work that you're doing in Sounds Nature. You have to talk to them. She attended a NASA Citizen Science Leaders Community event. And in this event, she found two presenters in this event. Here's my wife over here on the right. And here are two of my co-authors and collaborators on this project that were in this event with Rihanna back in 2023. And of course, the project that she was talking about or describing was Eclipse SoundScapes. And I want to show you a short video, if this will work, about Eclipse SoundScapes.
During a total solar eclipse, it is almost like day becomes night very quickly.
So knowing that there's going to be a change in that light and life-giving energy means that we can predict when animals are going to have a rapid shift in their behavior,
which results in changes in the acoustic environment or the soundscape.
So the Eclipse SoundScapes project is a project to determine how eclipses affect life here on Earth.
And there's a lot more to observation than just what you see. It's also important to think about what you hear.
We're measuring how the rapid onset of darkness during an eclipse affects wildlife by measuring the changes in sounds that they make.
The general public is best suited for this type of project because the general public is everywhere.
And that's really the power of the participatory science component of this project. It enables recordings and observations of soundscapes across the diversity of ecosystems covered by the path of totality. We might think of some ecosystems having a greater influence of human activities on the soundscape, whereas in other ecosystems, say a remote part of a national park, we might have a lower influence of human activities and greater influence from the sounds of life and Earth.
So that's a cool video. It's like 3 minutes long. You can go to the website and check it out. But I think it gives a nice 1-minute overview of the focus of this project. So we have Sounds of Nature, and in my humble opinion, I thought it was a relatively successful citizen science project. We connected with hundreds of people. We learned some interesting things. And then also, by the summer of 2023, SIU's campus was abuzz with discussion and anticipation of the 2024 total eclipse. As many of you in the audience know, if you're here, Carbondale was geographically significant as the crossroads of the 2017 and 2024 eclipse. And then we have the ERISA Lab and Eclipse SoundScapes. And it just felt like a really natural relationship to partner with them on this particular project, given my background. So my journey to the sun was through that, several organizations coming together, several citizen science projects joining forces to kind of study how wildlife responded during this really cool and fun event that we got to experience here in Southern Illinois. So as I mentioned, the Eclipse SoundScapes project is a NASA citizen science project funded by NASA Science Activation and studying how eclipses affect life on Earth. And the Eclipse SoundScapes project was focused on two events. They were focused on the 2023 annular eclipse and the 2024 total eclipse, right? And, I get this question a lot when I talk to wildlife researchers, what is an annular and what is a total? But I know I have a lot of people in here who are aware of that. But I had to put this slide up here just to remind folks in the audience, in case you're unaware, that the 2023 annular eclipse was about 90% coverage. It's a very special type of solar eclipse, but it usually doesn't go to full totality like we had in that total eclipse. And my understanding is that that coverage ranged from like 89 to 95%, depending on where you were in relation to totality, but I just say approximately 90% coverage, right? And if you're unfamiliar, it had a path like this. It occurred on October 14th, 2023, up through Oregon and down kind of through Texas if we're just focused on the United States. So they were trying to study eclipse soundscapes during this event, and they were also interested, of course, in the 2024 total eclipse that took place on April 8th, 2024, which is we're getting close to the 1 year mark. Right? And one of the key, I would say the key science question, as you heard in the video and as you heard me say today, is how does life on Earth, specifically wildlife, respond to solar eclipses? And really, in many ways, this Eclipse Soundscapes project set out to recreate that study from 100 years ago that took place in northeastern United States. They wanted to power with the people, partner with the public through participatory sciences to learn about wildlife response to the eclipses, right? And there were several ways that you could participate. You could become an apprentice, which is just you take time to learn about eclipses using free online lessons through the Eclipse Soundscapes project. You could be an observer, where you are listening, feeling, responding to the eclipse, and you write in responses to that. Now that would be very similar to our Wheeler study from 100 years ago. We had people observing things. Or you could be a data collector. And as you can see here, you may not realize it, but this individual is carrying a sound recorder with them. So a data collector is very much in line with what I was doing, or what we were doing in the Sounds of Nature project. So my focus here is mostly on the data collectors, but know that those observers were sending qualitative data to North Carolina State University, which is being analyzed in a separate study. I'm focused on the sound recording data. And one part of Eclipse Soundscapes that was so appealing and interesting to me was that the sampling protocol was very, very similar. We were having folks sign up online, and some were able to get a free sound recorder sent out to them in the mail. They receive it, they follow instructions, they deploy it in their backyard, they send it back. The only really difference is that, the one similarity is that it was 5 days, like the Sounds of Nature project, but they did it where it was with respect to the eclipse, right? So we listened for 2 days before the eclipse, during the eclipse, and 2 days after the eclipse. And they also deviated in that these sound recorders were running for 24 hours a day. For 5 days was the goal. So lots and lots of data, very, very similar, as I mentioned, to the Sounds of Nature project. But I realize that many of you in this audience have probably not used one of these sound recorders. They are what we call in wildlife science an autonomous recording unit, an ARU. And that is just that it is a programmable sound recorder. Here we're looking at a brand called an AudioMoth. And AudioMoths have an onboard microphone, of course. They have an onboard SD card. And on the back side of this is 3 AA batteries. You can program them to record whenever you want. It can be 24 hours a day. It can be 10 minutes every day at noon. It can be 4 hours in the morning. You can program them however. They will run until either the memory card is full, the batteries run out, or something crashes. All of those options are possible. And in the field, it would look something like this. In our Sounds of Nature project, we would put them in these wonderful camouflage bags. There is a sewing machine in my lab here on campus. It's not something I anticipated needing as a researcher here at SIU, but we have a sewing machine on campus. We would deploy it on a tree with some zip ties, let it run for several days. And coupled with the hundreds of participants that Eclipse Soundscapes had recruited, we set out to collect a bunch of new data for this particular project. And just to kind of give you an idea of what that might look like, data collection we did, here are some pictures uploaded by Trey and Mary Kay about the hundreds of what it looks like to receive hundreds of packages in the mail. They come in and there's a lot of organized chaos that's going on, and I'll let you decide whether the cat was being helpful here or not being helpful. I have my opinion. And then just to show you visually what this looks like, going back to our 2023 eclipse, here's a map of all the recordings that was received during the 2023 total eclipse, annular eclipse. And here's some summary about the number of deployments during the annular eclipse. You can't see this, but we had 130 deployments collected, 77 of which were able to be analyzed. That is, 77 of those went exactly how we wanted them to go. We had all the recordings, nothing failed, it was all great. And what you can't see down below, but you can see part of it, resulted in 4.8 terabytes of data from the annular eclipse. And just to kind of put into perspective that previous study from 100 years ago, they were kind of focused right up over here, right? So hopefully this shows you the distribution of sampling locations and the additional analyses that you could start to ask, or the scientific questions you could start to ask around wildlife responses to eclipse. Namely, we could start to think about how proximity to the path mediates potentially the response of wildlife, if you're right in the path versus outside the path. And also, this path and all the sampling locations are in a very different land cover conditions. Some are in cities, some are in the countryside, some are in mountains, some are wherever. So we can start to understand how the conditions around the sampling location might also mediate those. I work in some other projects on bright lights, and maybe bright lights or dark skies might have an effect on how wildlife respond. So that's just a glimpse of how you might be able to start asking different questions that the previous study was not able to ask given its geographic area that it covered. And of course, they really ramped it up, Eclipse SoundScapes really ramped it up during the total eclipse, and lots of deployments went out during this particular period. And I'm excited to say that the Sounds of Nature folks increased the data collection capacity of Eclipse SoundScapes by 20%. So that was really exciting and really a big benefit to both projects to be involved in it. And for here are some stats. We had 383 deployments, 77 from the Sounds of Nature folks, and we had about 280 that we could analyze, resulting in just under 20 terabytes of data. And I do want to pull out and note that I appreciate Portland's commitment to science. Despite their distance from totality, we still did receive an observation all the way over on the coast. So that was great to have. So between the annular and the total, we're at 25 terabytes of data. And now we needed a plan to figure out how we are going to wade through this analysis, right? So for us wildlife scientists, this is a lot of data. Unlike most other wildlife monitoring data, ARUs or sound recorders really accumulate data much quicker. This next slide, I want to show you some typical wildlife sampling techniques and how we accumulate data in those. On the y-axis, we have gigabytes. And on the x-axis, we have a few common techniques for sampling wildlife populations. Wildlife cameras or trail cameras are very common. If you have a big project, cover some decent geographic area for a long time, you could maybe get to a terabyte of data with wildlife photos. Animal movement, even though difficult to get this data, it's really just a line on a spreadsheet. Every fix is just a line on a spreadsheet. It doesn't take that much. Field observation, people used to spend a lot of time in the field observing wildlife. And I think that still happens, but you can see how much data that takes. Not very much at all. So taking this same graph, adding our acoustic recorders onto it, it really shows how much data we were dealing with compared to other common wildlife sampling techniques. This is the same terabyte of wildlife camera data next to our acoustic recorder data. So this is a problem. This is a problem that we have to figure out how to solve. In fact, it's really 25 terabytes. You make sure I'm not saying gigabytes. It's about the same as 25 of your standard personal computers at your house, right? This is a lot of information. With these total deployments of 460, that was close to about 46,000 hours of sound data if everyone ran for 5 days for 24 hours like we wanted it to. If we were to listen to this for 8 hours a day, it would take us 16 years, okay? It's not possible. Even with the power of the people, someone would get tired of listening to this all day long, okay? So we have to come up with different ways of analyzing this data. It turns out, as many in this room maybe are aware, computers are really good at image recognition, but they're not the best at sound recognition. So our first step in processing all of this sound data is we turn the sound into a picture. And we say, hey, that's a prothonotary warbler. This is a parula. This is a cardinal. This is a tufted titmouse. This is the thing we like. This is the thing we care about. And we go and find hundreds of examples of this, thousands if you can. And you say, this is the bird's sound. This is what this bird looks like, the sound looks like. Computer, go find it. And this is what I'm describing. It's just a convolutional neural network. You maybe have heard of machine learning algorithms. One of the most common machine learning algorithms in the wildlife science is called BirdNet. It's a machine learning algorithm that identifies bird species from sound data. And the way that it works is it pulls from this database of bird calls. It has hundreds of thousands of individual bird species. And it is looking through 3-second bits. So it takes the sound data. We have some raw audio data and metadata about where it was deployed and when it was deployed. It turns every one of those spectrograms into a 3-second clip. And it goes and looks through its knowledge, if you will, its database, and says, do any of these 3-second clips look like any of these birds that I know about? And it goes through the algorithm and spits out probabilities. And it says, it looks a lot like this, but maybe it's this or maybe it's this. And from this process, we end up with what I showed you a few slides ago of predictions of birds at a particular site. And they all come with a confidence score or a probability of correctness, right? And it's up to us to go through and verify and vet that process. But in general, this is one relatively quick way that we can use very current technology to process years and years of sound data, right? And why it's useful for this particular project is we can quickly learn about vocalizing species throughout all of those sound recorders. We can get a list of species when they were vocalizing, when they were not vocalizing, and at which locations they were vocalizing, of course, right? And if you do this for a long time and over long periods of time and many sampling locations, you could eventually start to track changes in biodiversity and ecosystem health. And it supports the Eclipse SoundScapes project by detecting how bird activity changes during these eclipses, right? We get species-specific insights into the response to the eclipse, and potentially this algorithm can identify non-bird species. It can do many mammals, dogs, squirrels, coyotes, wolves. It can also, it's also trained on some insect species. So it has a framework where you can even train it on your own species. So it is useful for things other than birds or taxa other than birds. So it has a lot of power potentially to support Eclipse SoundScapes. And I will say though that BirdNet's often incorrect. It doesn't always know. BirdNet can sometimes mess up. And it could report a prairie chicken in downtown Carbondale. And let me tell you, this joke usually goes over really, really well with wildlife audiences. But I realize I might be dealing with some heliophysics researchers in here or something like that. So please let me be the first to tell you that this greater prairie chicken should not be in downtown Carbondale. It maybe should be in a prairie, hence its name, greater prairie chicken, right? So it isn't perfect. Like any convolutional neural net, it is not perfect. But we have some ways where we can wade through the output and try to make it a little bit more accurate in our process. Another way we could have went about handling that data is something called soundscape analysis. And basically with soundscape analysis is we are trying to rely on something called an acoustic index to measure sound. And mostly we think about taking different taxa or organisms and looking at the frequency in which they're vocalizing over time, and maybe focus on specific bands of frequency bands that we're interested in to try to look at activity in those particular bands. And an acoustic index is just a mathematical function or formula saying how frequencies change throughout a time period, or how many frequencies are present in the soundscape might indicate biodiversity at a particular site. It's really kind of like a pulse of a place by listening to its sounds. And we use these to understand patterns in nature and how they're changing. But it's really more of a relative measure. Okay? Again, they're just kind of summarizing sound recordings into numbers that reflect different qualities of the soundscape, usually focused on biodiversity. One of those that turns out to be pretty accurate, well, relatively speaking, or correlated with biodiversity is one called CityNet. And CityNet is focused on trying to identify places that have anthropogenic noise and biotic noise. So it goes through, and it's also a convolutional neural net. It'll listen to 1 second of audio and report on whether there's anthropogenic or biotic noise in that 1 second clip. And sometimes it'll be just anthropogenic, sometimes biotic, sometimes neither, or sometimes both. And so from this next graph's a little messy, but we have time on the x-axis. It's a 1 minute clip. On the y-axis is an average activity level. And in the green, we have biotic noise, and in the blue, we have anthropogenic noise. And you can see how these measures change over time. And they're kind of noisy, and they're just reflecting changes in the sound file over time. And just to give you an example, here's a CityNet output on April 8th. So it's in UTC time, so these timestamps might look a little wrong or a little different to you. But on April 8th, at one of our recordings, you can see a very strong decrease in biotic sound, average biotic sound, at that deployment. So this suggests that it is certainly reflecting some biotic noise at these sites, and that it does seem like a really promising approach for quickly learning about what's going on at the site that's not specific to birds or really even species specific. So I would say that SoundScape analyses or CityNet, they are a measure of change in the acoustic environment. They're non-species specific, and we can get at multi-taxa changes in the acoustic environment by going this route. Cons, I would say that the output is less tangible, and it's a little bit relative. Like, what does it mean for biotic noise to decrease by 0.1? We don't know what that actually does mean. We can say how it changes relative to another site, but it's not like, oh, there are 3 less birds vocalizing than there are over here. It's not that same type of output. And the literature does have some mixed results on correlations with species richness or biodiversity measures. So they're still developing. It still might be a promising route. But for this particular talk and this particular analysis, I wanted to focus on BirdNet. Okay? And right now, it's still early stages, getting through that 25 terabytes of data. But I do have some output I can show you from at least 3 questions. Question number 1, the highest level question: do bird vocalization patterns change during an eclipse? That's what we're interested in. If so, which species stop and which continue to vocalize during that eclipse if we are seeing a change in vocalization activity during this event? And then finally, in one way that kind of really separates us from previous studies and shows the power of participatory sciences is we're trying to ask, well, what is the timing of this behavioral response with respect to totality? How early before and how long after totality are we seeing this behavioral response? And this is certainly something that can't be done on a local scale with just one individual. This takes a large data set over large space to be able to get this question. So I think it really illustrates the power of participatory sciences and current technology to advance what is known about wildlife responses to eclipses. Okay, so to get at this first question, we approached it this way. We took our 5 days of recordings that I told you all about, and we looked at the 4-minute for this particular, I'll just round and say 4 minutes. We looked at the period of totality. So here is the start of totality. Here, let's call that peak totality, and here's the end. So, was it 4 minutes or so here in Southern Illinois? And we looked at that across all of those 4 days of recordings, or 5 days. It just depends on how long the particular deployment was. And we said, how does the eclipse the 4-minute period during the eclipse day differ from these non-eclipse days? And what we were trying to do within each of these 4-minute periods was estimate the probability of vocalization or probability of a bird vocalizing during this 4-minute period with respect to whether it was actually happening during the eclipse. That's how we approached this one question. And I'm going to show you some just broad scale, high level result of that. On the Y, we have the probability of vocalization. Note that these probabilities are small because it's during some random 4-minute window. It's relatively small. And on the X, we have some non-eclipse day or during totality. So what we see here is that we do seem to have some decrease in vocalization activity during totality, but it's certainly still overlapping with the non-eclipse day, right? Just mind you that all the species and all the sites are kind of being clumped in one analysis. This is a broad level. Are we seeing changes in vocalization? It's noisy. It's not allowing for species-specific variation. It's not allowing for site variation that I was describing earlier on. So, asking the question, do bird vocalization patterns change during eclipse? I'm kind of at maybe. Let's take a closer look. So I think the way we can take a closer look is getting at that species-specific responses, because I'm thinking what's clumped up here is like, well, maybe some are and some aren't, and it's all getting kind of muddled in the result, right? So I went to a species-specific level, and I'm going to show you another plot, and I'll explain it. I'm just going to show you with one bird. It's our old familiar backyard friend, the tufted titmouse. And here we're looking at what was its probability of vocalizing on the non-eclipse or not during totality, and what was its probability of vocalizing during totality, and what is the difference between those two probabilities? So if we have any bird that has a yellow in the following graphs, we're going to say that it had a decreased vocalization activity during the eclipse. Its probability of vocalizing has decreased during that 4-minute period compared to non-totality days. Okay? And any bird that has black color next to it, they increase their vocalization activity during the eclipse. Okay, I'm going to expand this, and there's going to be about 20 birds that you're going to see here in a second. Okay, all the way at the bottom, our good old friend the tufted titmouse. I just told you about the tufted titmouse. Relatively strong response, really, out of all species. You know, this is a subset of species that had sufficient observations in the data set for us to actually say something with. So this is not a complete list of birds we heard or detected. It's those that we were able to analyze with some reliability. So all these birds here in the yellow are those that we saw a decreased vocalization activity during totality. And the top 4 down there at the bottom, we have the common grackle, brown-headed cowbird, red-bellied woodpecker, and tufted titmouse. All got very quiet, relatively speaking, during the eclipse. On the flip side of that figure, we have a number of species who actually increased vocalization activity during the eclipse. And some of these might come as a surprise to the birders in the room, but we maybe can talk about that. But of course, at the very top, we have our barred owl, followed by American robin, blue jay, and white-throated sparrow. So this was kind of fun, and it kind of suggested to me that on that previous slide, maybe some of this was getting tucked behind species level or site level variation. So I took this and I said, well, maybe there's some family level patterns. We zoom out from the species and we go to the family level. Maybe there's some family level patterns that can come out in the data. And it's really not that much different than what we just saw here. So now instead of species on the Y, we have family level, and we still have that change in vocalization activity here. And up top, the top 2 families that had the most change in vocalization activity would be the owls and the corvids, of course. And then down below, the top 2 families that had the greatest decrease in vocalization activity would be the tits or the chickadees and the cowbirds, orioles, and blackbirds or grackles. So this was kind of fun and interesting. I feel like we're kind of going down a fun path with this about learning about who has changed vocalization activity during the eclipse compared to a non-eclipse. And then that third question that we were after was the timing of the behavioral response. So it definitely seems that there were some species-specific responses to the eclipse with magnitude of change varying at the species level. And when we did this overall analysis, it just maybe wasn't capturing that. So we're interested in the timing of the behavioral response. And again, I really think this path of analysis is where the power of the participatory sciences and current technology allow us to advance our knowledge about this. So I'm going to show you a series of slides, and I'm showing you a blank one right now to orient you with the figure before we put a bunch of data up there. On the y-axis, we are going to have the average number of vocalizations per minute. So this is across sites and across species. We looked at a site, ignored the species name, and said how many vocalization detections were happening on any given minute. And we had hundreds of sites, so we took those numbers and we averaged them across the hundreds of sites, right? And on the x-axis is time relative to eclipse. So here at this vertical line here at 0 is first contact, right when the party started. Here in the middle would be totality. We have the second and the third contact in the smaller dashed line, and peak right there on the longer dashed line. And the final, the ending, fourth contact over here. Okay, so it's all going to be time relative to eclipse. And you're going to see 2 lines come across this plot that will show different responses. One of them is on some non-eclipse day, the average response on a non-eclipse day. And then the black line will be the eclipse day. Okay? So here it is. We can see that on some random day during this 5-day deployment, we kind of expect pretty variable but consistent vocalization activity during this time period. I'll talk to you about this in a second. On the eclipse, particularly here, we see a pretty significant dip in vocalization activity over time. And I just showed you a few slides ago showing you that we do have changes in vocalization activity from the breeding bird community. But what this plot does that the previous plots have not done is we can look at when we start to see changes in the slope of this line with respect to totality. And this starts to allow us to say, right around 22 minutes prior to totality, we start seeing a decrease in vocalization activity. And if you can think back to that day almost a year ago, I felt different 20 minutes before eclipse, before totality. It felt different to me. And it's really interesting to see the birds feeling differently as well. And then, of course, this second line is when I say things are returning to normal. If I were going to draw a straight line across there, right, we can see this return to normal about 49 minutes after totality. And this thing that I told you I was going to tell you about, in a lot of these deployments, it was starting to be dusk or night. So whether it's on an average day or eclipse day, the birds are just getting quieter towards the end of the day. There's nothing really significant about those dips at the end. But they are kind of like, well, why is there such a strong response at the end of the day? So this is really, again, I think promising, and something that we've really never been able to do, to my knowledge, is understand when these effects start to kick in with wildlife. So I took this same approach and I applied it to the nocturnal species. I looked through all the list of birds that were detected, and I pulled out those that typically are nocturnal species, and I wanted to look at changes in vocalization activity of the nocturnal bird community on some average minute. And here is what we see with that. This yellow line, again, is some average day, and here is eclipse day. And you can see with respect to totality, this increase in vocalization probability as we reach totality. It's primarily, I dug into the data, it was just these two species, the barred owl and the great horned owl. And just to also tell you, and this is kind of early where this analysis is going, it's not fully developed yet, but if we look at the same eclipse day and look outside of the path, there's no response. It's only within the path of totality that we're seeing a signal from these nocturnal birds. So I would say this is still early stages. It takes a while to get through these 25 terabytes of data, but we're starting to find some interesting and fun things, I think. But lots more questions and analysis to do. More on that in just a bit. I want to go back as a summary to that 1932 study. And of course, I have to show you some more quotes because they're so much fun. Let's go back to the Wheeler study, and we'll see what Mr. Bailey said. Mr. Bailey heard about 10 species of birds, and it was noticeable that as the eclipse progressed, there was a decrease in the chorus with a silence during totality. We did document many bird species quieting down during totality, right? But we documented another range of species that started increasing vocalizations during this event. And one thing that differs, I would say, is that we have some probability associated with these, and we have a magnitude of change at the species level. Certainly, Mr. Bailey was not able to report on this. I would also say that it's kind of interesting that we're able to start to say when these things started happening. So Mr. Bailey says that he heard that there was as the eclipse progressed, there was a decrease. Well, now we're able to kind of pinpoint with some modeled output of how long before and after these effects appear to be taking place on the bird community. Another report from a zookeeper, Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg reports very little sign of unusual behavior among his birds, but 3 of the 9 great horned owls did become active as if night was coming on. Of course, I showed you our nocturnal bird community. We have this increase. Great horns were in this black line here, vocalizing during totality. And I will also say there was another report in the paper of several, specifically about barred owls, several reports of hooting from wilder sections in New Hampshire. The barred owl was our most vocal nocturnal species. They also tend to kind of be one of the most territorial and dominant owl species that you can deal with. There's lots of concerns in the Pacific Northwest about the barred owl and the great northern owl. It's really often considered an aggressive species. So it's interesting to see how vocal and how territorial it was in some abrupt light change, such as in the eclipse. But it kind of tracks with what we know about this species' behavior. So that was really interesting. There's a section in this paper about diurnal land birds. And they go through and list individual species responses here all throughout the paper. This goes on to the next page. I just took one little screenshot of it. But I would say this section in the paper is where our data maybe starts to deviate from the Wheeler study. Otherwise, we're in a lot of agreement with the Wheeler study. I would say here, though, they report on the quieting of blue jays and robins. And if you remember back to our figure, blue jays and robins were quite up there. If you know anything or think about birds at all, robins are pretty well known for their evening chorus. They have one last bout before the party's over, before the night hits. So it's possible that they interpret that change in light as evening approaching and they think that they potentially thought that we're heading into night, and they quickly jumped into an evening chorus. That could be one response. I will say though, well, another thing I'll say is that there seems to be pretty consistent reports of blackbirds and grackles. Just as they found here, we were also finding that they got pretty quiet during the eclipse. But this paper was often one report from this person and one report from this person. And I think maybe that's why we're able to deviate so much when we have observations across such large space that we can start to see that there are some nuances in how, for example, American robin might respond during totality that was not previously possible over a relatively restricted area. Yeah, that was the family level response. So there's this consistent family level response. And these three, I just pulled out these three strongest families. We, of course, have the same findings that they were having over here. And, you know, the old world sparrows or the house sparrow also seem to really quiet down during this event. We're just kind of able to quantify it in a way that they were not able to. And, you know, there's lots of reasons why we might be thinking these families would be quieting down during this time period. But it's interesting to see that our data coming out similar to the 100-year-old study. So where are we headed? What am I going to work on? I really want to get at this proximity totality question. We don't have to bend it inside of the path and outside of the path. We can say kilometer, half a kilometer, a tenth of a kilometer, where we start to see no change in the analysis. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Next thing that I want to focus on, another thing I want to focus on, you may have not caught it in all these graphs I was showing you, but there's this interesting, like, what I'm calling the dawn chorus reprise right here as we come out of totality in vocalization activity. And I want to look a little closer at this and see who is doing this and what might be going on with the behavioral response during this minute just coming out of the darkness. And of course, I've told you very, very little about the annular eclipse. That's totally on our radar. It's totally something we're working on doing. And this is a really unique opportunity for us to say how these responses vary during an annular versus a total. And that's totally where we are headed. And as I started to hint earlier, we need to know about non-bird responses. So we want to focus on the insect community. The insect community usually responds very quickly to changes in light sources. So we want to focus on that in our future analyses. Okay, I've almost kept you here till 4 o'clock. Thousands of people participated in this project. And like any participatory science project, we cannot do this without the power of the people or the power of the public. So I'm certainly thankful for all the contributions that Eclipse SoundScapes volunteers, observers, data collectors, apprentices made to this project. I'm also really proud and thankful for all the contributions of people in Southern Illinois through the Sounds of Nature project that contributed to the Eclipse SoundScapes project. I think that was huge. And I also really want to say special thanks to Mary Kay and Trey at Arista Lab. They're fantastic people to work with, and I'm so thankful to be a part of this project with them as we work through this really fun analysis. And again, thanks to NASA Science Activation for the support of this research. So that's it. If you've got any questions, maybe we have a little time.
Thank you so much. All right, we have about 8 minutes for questions. And we've got 2 mics because we are live streaming. So we'll bring a mic to you if you would. Who's got questions?
Hey, thanks for a great talk. It was really interesting and thought-provoking.
Cool.
I have a comment to share and a question. So about a year ago, I downloaded the Merlin app from the Cornell Ornithology Lab. Mm-hmm. And it's really great. Some of the data you were showing, like with the sound traces and things, that I've even gotten to the point now where I see one and I can, I know what species that is, right? Just because I've seen it so many times. But if people are interested in that, it's a really great app. You can put it on your smartphone and just go out in your yard. I've learned a lot about bird biodiversity and things like that right in my backyard, so it's been great. My question is, I gave a talk in this series a couple months back, and in that talk I shared some of the data that I recorded during the eclipse, climate data, weather and climate data. And one of the things that I was really surprised to find is that the minimum temperature actually occurs about 8 to 10 minutes following totality. And that seemed inconsistent with what I observed during the eclipse, but the data shows it very, very clearly. And so what I noticed in your data was that the minimum in bird activity actually occurs well after totality. And I wondered if, I came in here thinking these birds are primarily responding to light, but I wondered if there could be other environmental cues like temperature, for example, that could be playing a role.
I think that's a great question. Well, first off, I do want to say that the Merlin app is great. It's a very, very similar approach to BirdNet. They technically do have different underlying algorithms, but it's a fantastic thing to have in your backyard and learn about the birds around you. Dr. Shoup's question is really interesting and really great. You know, I think of like storms, incoming storms, and how if you talk to anybody, the older adults, they'll tell you that the birds know the weather's coming, right? And that's not necessarily a signal of changes in light often. It could be a changes in pressure, temperature. So I think there's something certainly going on there. It's not something I haven't fully explored at all here. But yeah, it certainly makes sense to think about changes in the environment beyond light, causing some behavioral response, confusion, concern, retreat back to the nest. You know, a lot of these vocalization activities are happening during foraging or territorial defense. So whenever they start to feel a change or observe a change, there might be a retreat from those activities, which results in the change in vocalization activity as a retreat from those activities. That could be something that's going on here, but I haven't definitely not explored weather related to it.
Who else has got a question for us?
Yeah, thanks for this. This is great. Just wondering, the 1930 study and yours have a lot of data points in partial eclipse, and you had your annular eclipse. But is there any reason to think that your returns would be any different than, say, a cloudy day?
Oh, that's interesting. I feel like the heliophysics people should answer that question. It certainly felt different to me than a cloudy day. You know, I've only experienced one total eclipse, and I don't really remember the annular, but I guess I was in Southern Illinois. But yeah, I feel like the light change is very different than a cloudy day. I think another thing about that is the abruptness of the change. When we head into a cloudy day and we're putting our shoes on and going to work, it's cloudy. It's dark and it's gray. This light changed pretty quickly. I mean, you know, even 20 minutes before, the light was looking different, right? But it was in that period of totality that was an abrupt change. So I think it's the timing and the pacing of that change that we would expect some change. But, you know, you're focused on outside of the path of totality. And I would still just argue that maybe it has something to do with the rate at which light was changing and how it could trigger something. Dr. Allen.
Wrong doctor.
Oh, sorry.
I'm curious about bird interaction. I'm curious about bird interaction because there's a lot of call and response within species, different times of the year, mating seasons and the like, and warning off territorialism that went on. Is there any way to collect data on that kind of interactions within species and between species that might be relevant to understanding better the effects of the eclipse?
Yeah, so the question was, how does species interactions maybe mediate or contribute to these responses to the eclipse? And we have a pretty large data set where we're actually working on, Neil Gilbert, an Oklahoma State colleague, and I are working on a different project where we're focused on how that might affect the activity patterns or the behavioral vocalization of birds. And it's possible that that had an impact on who was vocalizing and who was not vocalizing. But the one thing that I'll say is that it's a little bit difficult to pull out because it's if we're just focused on totality within the path, it's such a short period of time. We do get vocalizations every 3 seconds. We get reports of what birds were probably vocalizing during that time. And we could compare different sites about how the vocalizing community differs across these sites and how we see differential responses from a given species. It's not something I've done yet, but it could potentially. I just feel like there was so much going on. You know, they weren't getting KSDK reports that there was a total eclipse coming on April 8th, right? The birds were unaware. So they were very much, I think, in a flight or fight response of what's going on? Is the world ending today? I better be quiet for a little while. Some were not. You know, the barred owl popped off quite a bit. But I think they had other things on their mind rather than trying to be interacting with interspecific competition at the site. I could be off on that. Something I'll look into, but I haven't done it yet.
Any other questions?
There's actually a question from chat, the YouTube chat.
All right.
I was wondering if you have looked at the types of sound that birds were making. So,
Oh, fun.
differences between like song and, chirping, that kind of stuff.
Am I still on YouTube right now?
Yes.
I have not done that. We technically could do that. We have all the sound recorders. That's one really powerful thing about sound recorders versus like a traditional wildlife point count, is that we have a permanent voucher of those vocalization activities. So we could go back and review what type of vocalization activities were happening, or what type of vocalizations were happening. I definitely have not done that. That kind of goes back to that 16 years of listening that I have not engaged in. But that sounds interesting. I haven't done it. I'm sorry that I have so many analytical shortcomings right now. We're just in the early stages, I guess.
I can't believe you haven't listened to 16 years of,
I'm working on it.
sounds in the
Right.
last year. I mean, come on.
Right.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I don't know if you would know this, but where are you storing 25 terabytes of data?
Oh.
Like, how much does that cost?
So this is a great question. If Dr. Winter was here, Arissa Lab, Dr. Winter, he would probably be a little frustrated to talk about this because it's a very, very challenging problem. He has a Linux server and a basically deck that stores a bunch of external hard drives. On my desk right now, over in Ag Science, I have 6 hard drives, all full of sound recordings. It turns out it's very difficult to transfer 25 terabytes of data. Snail mail is still the most efficient way to do this. If you were to try to stash 25 terabytes on the cloud, it would be very expensive to do. If you want to try to transfer those files over, that would take a long time. So they have permanent copies. It's actually a really great question. I want to prompt this next slide. They have permanent copies. I have copies. It's hard to do. But one of the key things, a key tenet of citizen science, is that we publicly share the data with the people who collected the data. 25 terabytes is difficult to do. Dr. Winter and Mary Kay have been working endlessly to do this. And the data, I'm excited to report, if you're excited about this, is in the process of going to Zenodo. Zenodo is a public database for sharing usually data associated with research projects. So I have all the text associated with this event. You can go on to Zenodo, we're in the process, continuing through 2025, to upload the audio data from the annular and the total. It's being uploaded, a free and open source online database, long-term public access to the data. Technically, anybody could go and download all 25 terabytes of this data and do whatever analysis they want to do, or if they wanted to listen for 16 years, they could do that too. You can do anything with it. They're uploading some raw unprocessed data and also some metadata about those deployments. This is a lot of effort, and Trey has been working endlessly to pull this off. So that was my 2 cents on that. That's a great question. That's the hardest part about all this.
All right, if we could please, let's thank our wonderful speaker for a really amazing talk.
Thank you, appreciate it. And thanks for coming on Friday afternoon. I hope you all have a great day.
And I want to point out to everyone, in case you're not watching Eclipses, the night of March 13th into 14th, there's a total lunar eclipse.
Oh, cool.
Starts basically at midnight, but from midnight till 2:30 in the morning, we will be out on the lawn between Neckers and the engineering building. Public's welcome to join us. We're going to get the full blood moon effect. So that's the night of March 13th. You can see it from anywhere in the U.S., wherever you happen to be over spring break. Wake up in the middle of the night and check it out. All right, thanks for coming. I heard that. And I'm super